All right. So, good evening, everyone. I'm not going to attempt any opera either. But yeah, I decided to do some content on Absalom and then wrap up with David's census in 2 Samuel chapter 24, which is last chapter of 2 Samuel, so it kind of gets us to the end of. Doesn't get us David's death. David's death is recorded in 1 Kings, but it's actually the first time I've done kind of a deeper study of the Absalom narrative, but it's 5 chapters long, so I was trying to figure out the best way to kind of organize it. So here's where we are, and I'm surprised that we got through as much as we did over the course of 6 or 7 weeks. I can't remember. So we didn't spend a lot of time on David and Jonathan or David's coronation, which has some just fascinating narratives in 2 Samuel 5 and 6. But we gave a lot of time sufficient time to just introductory material, the anointing of David by the prophet Samuel, David and Goliath here under conquest, and then spent a whole evening on covenant in 2 Samuel 7. Looked at David's compassion or kindness, or hesed, his loving kindness shown to Mephibosheth, and then the fall collapse with Bathsheba, his adultery with Bathsheba and murder of Uriah, her husband. And then last week we looked at David's confession. It was prompted by Nathan the prophet confronting him. And then the recorded confession in Psalm 51. And so just 2 more lessons you can see there. Consequence, 2 Samuel chapter 13 through 18. So again, kind of a big chunk of material. We'll try to read through some of it, but we won't be able to read through all of it. And then next week, this interesting account of David taking a census and inciting the Lord's anger. And then that whole narrative there that has some important implications moving forward as well. So that's where we are. Looking at consequences then, 2 Samuel chapter 13 through 18. I haven't prayed yet, but maybe we should. Well, let's look at this and then we'll pray. This is how we're going to work through this material. I tried another alliterated sequence here of 8 points. I just tried to alliterate the adjectives here. So I would title this "Sons and Swords: Nathan's prophetic revelation and Absalom's failed rebellion." A story in 8 parts. I'm going to think what we have over these 6 chapters. And so it begins with a triggering event, and then a thought-out vengeance, a temporary reunion. Probably not the best word for that, but I'm just toying around with the alliteration. But it's kind of this superficial reunion, really. A treacherous insurrection then mounted by David's son Absalom. Troublesome departure or exile by David. A trustworthy prediction in chapter 16, end of chapter 16 anyway, and then the scheme is thwarted, and we end up with kind of a tragic conclusion, or a tragic end. So it gets us through the Absalom narrative in 8 parts. So I'll stop there and I'll open us up in prayer, okay? God in heaven, we thank you for your word. We pray that we would hear your voice that is living and active in Scripture. And Lord, that you would instruct our minds, instruct our hearts, and inform our lives as a result of what we read. Help us take away the lessons that you would have us take away. We would respond in faith and appropriate repentance, open our hearts to being convicted by these truths and also instructed and informed in the paths of righteousness. And above all, help us to see how these chapters in your word anticipate the greater David, our King Jesus, in whose name we pray. Amen.
Brian requested.
Is that beeping?
It is beeping.
Oh, sorry.
There's an error going on, so I'll work it.
You can turn it off.
Just ignore the beeps.
You can turn it off if you need to.
Well, it is off while I try to get Brian's there.
Okay, so let's look at this triggering event. I don't do this very often. I have this is my Bible that I read. This is always at home by my couch. So the one you see me with at church stays in my office. I grab it when I'm coming in the sanctuary and I put it out there. But I don't actually read it. I don't take notes and I don't jot anything down. But I brought this one from home because it's going to be easier for me to remember where stuff is at. So if you have a Bible tonight, you can look in 2 Samuel 13 and this triggering event that, I don't have any comments to start out with. Comments after. So this is how it all starts. Now note that this falls immediately on the heels of chapter 12. Now, we only read through the first 15 verses of chapter 12, so there's some other stuff to read about. The death of David's child that Bathsheba was carrying, and then the subsequent birth of Solomon, and then kind of a military excursus there in verses 26 through, 31 to end the chapter. But this is really right on the heels of David's sin with Bathsheba, his murder of Uriah, being confronted by Nathan, and then we're going to pick up the narrative here in chapter 13. And it begins this way. Now Absalom, David's son, had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar. And after a time, Amnon, David's son, loved her. So these are two of David's sons here, Amnon and Absalom. And Amnon, Tamar's other half-brother, loves her. And Amnon was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. So that doesn't sound all that great, right, as we start off here. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shimeah, David's brother. And Jonadab was a very crafty man, and he said to him, "O son of the king," notice the address there. It's like, hey, remember who you are, you're Amnon, you're son of the king. Why are you so haggard morning after morning? Will you not tell me? Amnon said to him, "I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." And Jonadab said to him, "Lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill. And when your father comes to see you, say to him, 'Let my sister Tamar come and give me bread to eat, and prepare the food in my sight, that I may eat it, that I may see it and eat it from her hand.'" And so Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. And when the king came to see him, Amnon said to the king, "Please let my sister Tamar come, and make a couple of cakes in my sight, that I may eat from her hand." And so then David brings Tamar in. We're going to skip some of this here. Skipping down to verse 11. "But when she brought them near to him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, 'Come lie with me, my sister.' She answered him, 'No, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this outrageous thing. As for me, where could I carry my shame? And as for you, you would be as one of the outrageous fools in Israel. Now, therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you.' But he would not listen to her, and being stronger than she, he violated her and lay with her." In other words, he rapes her. "And then Amnon hated her with very great hatred, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, 'Get up, go.' But she said to him, 'No, my brother, for this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me.' But he would not listen to her. He called the young man who served him and said, 'Put this woman out of my presence, and bolt the door after her.'" Notice that he refers to her as this woman after having raped her. Now she was wearing a long robe with sleeves, for thus were the virgin daughters of the king dressed. And so his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. And Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the long robe that she wore. And she laid her hand on her head and went away, crying aloud as she went. And her brother Absalom said to her, "Has Amnon your brother been with you? Now hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this to heart." So Tamar lived a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house. When King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. But Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. Okay, we'll stop right there. So I'm calling this the triggering event because see the verses that we read there. Amnon and Tamar are the lead characters here. They drive the story. But they are really serving to introduce Absalom's story. Look again in verse how 13 starts. "Now Absalom, David's son, had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar." This is really about Absalom. It's just telling us how this whole thing gets started. And it starts with Amnon's rape of Tamar. So again, just kind of a literary feature to see here, how this is all structured. It's kind of a chiasm again through the first 22 verses. Remember that in a chiastic structure, the middle is the central point. And so that would be E here. Amnon rapes Tamar, and his love for her turns to hate, verses 14 and 15. But notice again the mirroring thing here. We start with Amnon and his love for Tamar. It's really lust, right? He's lusting after Tamar. And it ends with Absalom's hate for Amnon for having raped Tamar. So there's kind of a mirrored thing there. If you look at B and B prime, Tamar comes to Amnon's house and bakes bread for him. Tamar leaves Amnon's house mourning for her fate. C, Amnon orders his servants out so that he might be alone with Tamar. And C prime, Amnon calls a servant back and orders him to lock Tamar out. So again, there's this interesting contrast here of the story. D, Amnon commands Tamar to come lie with him. She pleads with him, but to no avail. And this is contrasted by Amnon commands Tamar to get out, and she pleads to him, but to no avail. And then the central part there is the violation and the rape of Tamar. And so, but what's going to propel the narrative forward, this is the central part of the story we're reading here, but what's going to drive the larger narrative, chapters 13 and 18 forward, is where it leaves Absalom. Hates his brother, Amnon. But I don't know if you noticed something interesting here about David's response. I guess we'll get to that in a second. But, it's interesting that we're asked to believe that what we do sexually is no one else's business. We're told that all the time. What you do in the privacy of your own bedroom is your business, and it's not anybody else's. So how realistic is that really? How private does Amnon's lust turn out to be? Not very much. And if you think about the consequences of acting on sexual impulses and lust and sexual immorality, there are families that are broken up with it, children that deal with all kinds of family discord as a result. So we can't buy that kind of lie. But notice David's response here. David is very angry when he learned of Amnon's act. But that's all we read. If we pick up the narrative again, you can look there in verse 21. When King David heard all these things, so he's made aware of them, he was very angry. Now, some of you might have a little number there in your Bibles. Mine will take me down into I call it the basement. In case you want to look at those footnotes. And it says there that the Dead Sea Scroll and the Septuagint, which are other Bible manuscripts, add this. But he, referring to David, would not punish his son Amnon because he loved him, since he was his firstborn. Now that apparently is not in the more reliable text. It's not upstairs, right? But the point is, David, he's upset by it. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't redress the wrong. He's just upset. So that requires Absalom to just kind of sit with it, right? And he stews for quite some time. Why do you suppose David doesn't do anything? Well, I didn't mean to answer it on the slide, but I did. Well, remember, what did we just read about in chapters 11 and 12?
Bathsheba.
Yeah, we read about David and Bathsheba. And so he takes a woman that does not belong to him. It's not called rape in chapter 11, but certainly there's kind of an abuse of royal authority, an abuse of power that, we shouldn't imagine that Bathsheba has much ability to refuse the advances of the king. And so here, David's son does something very similar, takes a woman that doesn't belong to him, violates her, and maybe doesn't tell us why David doesn't act, but maybe the reason is, who am I really saying anything about that? It was wrong. I'm mad about it. I love my son Absalom. Not much I can do. So Absalom, very upset by what Amnon has done to Tamar, just kind of has to figure out, okay, the wrong is not going to be righted by my dad. Okay. So it's going to continue to propel the story for us. Keep that in mind. The wrong is not going to be righted by my dad. So, this is from Dale Ralph Davis. Dale Ralph Davis and Tim Chester's commentaries, they're both really, really good. I knew Davis's was good because all of his commentaries are good. But Tim Chester's has been quite good too as I've read through it. But this is what Dale Ralph Davis writes. How could he call Amnon to account when he himself had violated Bathsheba? Hardly a solid basis for exercising moral authority. And yet, such an argument does not negate David's responsibility. As both father and king, he is charged with maintaining justice, whether he is personally compromised or not. One may understand David's failure to act. One may not, however, excuse it. So Amnon remains an unpunished felon. Tamar languishes as damaged goods. And that's not meant to be an insult. Culturally, to have lost her virginity in this way is highly socially damaging to Tamar. And so she basically lives unmarried in Absalom's house for what we can tell the rest of her entire life. And so that's not meant to be unnecessarily insulting. It's that she's going to live a life of desolation as a result of what Amnon has done to her. And so it leaves her in that condition, and then Absalom becomes a seething vigilante. Not a good situation. Yeah, Ian.
So is David's inability to kind of respond in the right way directly related to even his own actions? Is it his shame that keeps him from acting accordingly, or is that sort of we don't know?
Yeah, at that point, I'd say we have to read between the lines a little bit. Shame, guilt, whatever it is, David's failure to act is going to propel the narrative along certain lines, particularly as far as Absalom is concerned. Yeah.
Whenever, in the Bible stories that I've read, sometimes whenever a woman is introduced, it's and so was a virgin.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean in the cultural context? That's never been explained to me before.
Well, certainly, to have been involved in fornication was, morally reprehensible in that culture. But lineages were also quite important. And remember that for Tamar particularly, and Amnon and Absalom, this is all within a royal lineage, which makes it even more scandalous, right? If Tamar is to bear a son, and the son is in the king's line, it's pretty important to know who the father of that child is. And for Amnon then to violate her in this way, even though, obviously in the course of time it would have been clear that she had not been impregnated, it does reduce the number of suitors that she would have. I would just say, I think about this more and more. I guess I'll just share this personally. I know I'm on tape here, but it's not that. I'm still in process of thinking about some of these things. So take this with a grain of salt. I'll just share some of my personal thoughts about this. Probably 20 years ago, I'm 55, so probably around the time I was 35, I would listen to Roman Catholic teaching on the use of contraceptives, right? And just think, wow, what a radical kind of position to take. And if you don't know the Roman Catholic position, it's that you don't use any contraception whatsoever. It's not permissible in the sight of God, and so you just use natural birth control methods, right? But no outward kinds of contraception. I would just think, yeah, what a radical position. Now that I'm 55, and hearing some of the abortion debates that happen, and particularly the way abortion debates almost assume that people get pregnant like people catch COVID. Right? It's just like some, chance accident that you've been infected, and to withhold treatment from this problem is an awful thing to do to somebody. And I just think we have driven such a wedge between sexual intercourse and the possibility of bearing a child that some of the social dialogue, not all of it, but some of the social dialogue, it almost removes it from the equation. And so the idea of, look, and again, I think sometimes it's not well nuanced. I don't know how much to get into this, just because we have so much to cover tonight. But I heard somebody the other day just talking about, a child is in the image of God at the moment of conception, and to terminate that pregnancy is to adopt a death ethic, and there's no compromising on that. That was kind of the tone of this person I was listening to, which generally I would agree with that statement. But anybody who knows what an ectopic pregnancy is has to recognize that there are situations in which, okay, there's complicated decisions that have to be made here. An ectopic pregnancy is basically when the embryo implants in the fallopian tubes. It's not viable.
It won't ever live.
It won't ever live.
Yeah.
No.
And so,
It's great danger to the mother.
yeah, a great danger to the mother. Like you have to go take care of that medically. And so, I mean, I think our conversations should keep those kinds of things in mind. I think our conversations should keep things in mind that, yeah, sometimes it's not just an ectopic pregnancy, but there's other kinds of situations in which the mother's health is highly at risk, and the mother might have 5 other living children. What do you do in a situation like that? That's complicated. So to pretend that there's no complications may not be most helpful, but to also recognize that most of the instances that we're talking about are not dealing with those kinds of complications. It sounds like the complication is, oh, I didn't want to get pregnant, and I don't want to be pregnant, and I shouldn't be pregnant, and so I should be able to get an abortion whenever I want and terminate this. It's like, if you don't want to get pregnant, I can tell you a really, really safe and certain way to avoid that. And that just seems, to me, I mean, some of these conversations, like, that's completely lost as part of the discussion here. Yeah, Paul.
That option is not available.
Yeah. Oh, I would agree in certain instances, but I don't think, again, that those are the instances that drive our social and cultural narrative here. So I think that's a point. I mean, so I'm just saying, I don't remember how I got onto this.
She asked about the importance.
Yeah, I know, but I feel like I answered Annabeth's questions. I can't remember how I got onto this, but.
Well, Tamar didn't get pregnant. That
Right,
was
yeah,
part
that's
of it.
right. She didn't get pregnant, but I think it's why was that so important in a culture like this? Well, remember that until the last 50 years, when oral contraceptives became affordable and widely available, like that's how you had to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, I think our modern technology has allowed us to drive a really large wedge in between the idea of pregnancy and how someone gets pregnant, and recognizing that there's a personal responsibility to take. If you don't want to be pregnant, I can't tell everybody in the room, if you don't want to get pregnant, I can tell you how to do that. And to act like that's not an option, I think just betrays the fact that we don't know how to control our bodies and our passions. That's also, by the way, I mean, we might live in a culture like that. As Christians, we shouldn't buy that narrative. You can't control your appetite for whatever that happens to be. It's not a Christian mentality at all. You're either going to be ruled by your appetites or you're going to rule your appetites. And I think the Bible is pretty clear on those things. Is it easy all the time? No. Can the Spirit empower you to exercise self-control in all areas of your life? Well, I certainly think so. But it seems like the narrative and the discussion is surprising to me sometimes when we talk about that. So I don't know if you want to edit that section out, because it's tangential, I think, to a little bit about what we're talking about here. But anyway, second thing, I want to try to get through the first 4 points, because there's 8. Remember, this is 8. So let's see if we can get halfway through it, and then we'll take a break. But Absalom's not going to leave it. So if you look in pick back up in verse 23. After 2 full years. Okay, so Absalom, he's waited a while. He's waited 2 years. And this is what happens. So notice again the literary artistry of the Bible. And I have to go to commentaries to see this stuff too. Like if you're thinking, I don't see this stuff when I read the Bible. I don't either. But when you see it, it's like, wow, it's not just somebody, spitting out a story without thinking about it. There's a literary craft in the Bible that's quite impressive. And by the way, that's part of the reason why I think I'll play around with words quite a bit. I'll play around with titles. I'll play around with alliteration a little bit. Because when I go to the Old Testament, it seems like God-inspired authors do that all the time. He crafted in a very creative way the way stories are told, the way things are structured, the way things are put together. For example, if you look in the first part that we read, chapter 13, Absalom's sister, Amnon, Jonadab, and David getting Tamar accessible, Amnon's rape of Tamar, the reaction, grief, tearing of garments, solace from Absalom, right? This is the first story that we just read. Reactions of David and Absalom. Those are the first 20 verses, or first 22 verses. Second part of the story, Absalom's sheep shearing, Absalom and David getting Amnon accessible, right? It's very similar to this. It's not a chiastic structure, but it's very similar. It mirrors it still. Absalom's murder of Amnon. There's a reaction, grief, tearing of garments. We haven't read that yet, but it's in the narrative. Solace from Jonadab, and then reactions of David and Absalom and others. So I mean, it's kind of a neat mirroring or retelling of, but not a retelling, the telling of a second story with the same kind of features in which the first part of the story is told.
Parallels.
Yeah, parallel. Very good. Yeah, parallel. Thank you. And so, that's what we get. But in the end, if we want to read through 13, Amnon has sheep shearers at Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim. And Absalom invited all the king's sons. And Absalom came to the king and said, "Behold, your servant has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant." The king said to Absalom, "No, my son, let us not all go, lest we be burdensome to you." And he pressed him, but he would not go, but gave him his blessing. And then Absalom said, "Well, if not, please let my brother Amnon go with us." And the king said to him, "Why?" Absalom pressed him until he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. So he's got a plan here. Then Absalom commanded his servants, "Mark when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, kill him. Do not fear. Have I not commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant." So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. And all the king's sons arose, and each mounted his mule and fled. They tell David all his sons are dead. David learns that not all his sons are dead, only Amnon. Verse 34, but Absalom fled, and the young man who kept watch lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, many people were coming from the road behind him by the side of the mountain. And Jonadab said to the king, "Behold, the king's sons have come, as your servant said, so it has come about." And as soon as he had finished speaking, behold, the king's sons came and lifted up their voice and wept. Remember, their brother Amnon has been killed. And the king also and all his servants wept very bitterly. But Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur. And David mourned for his son day after day. He's mourning after Amnon. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there for 3 years. And the spirit of the king longed to go out to Absalom because he was comforted about Amnon since he was dead. There's translation problems there. Note the things in your study Bible if you have one. So there's the thought out vengeance. 2 years. And then he finally takes action and murders Amnon. There are a little bit of echoes of Genesis 4 here. Do you remember what happens in Genesis 4? Cain and Abel. Difference, of course, is why does Cain kill Abel? Jealousy. What's the difference between Cain and Abel?
Their sacrifices.
Right. And what kind of here, getting there.
Unacceptable.
Right. He murders Abel because he's righteous. Why does Absalom murder Amnon? He's not righteous. It's not exactly the same story. But we do have this murder. And so note this. We talked about David's difficulty of addressing Amnon's what's the word I'm looking for? Rape of Tamar. I'm looking for a different word there. But notice also now what's taking place is his other son murders Amnon. And so here they're imitating the worst of David's acts. One of his sons takes advantage of a woman that's not his, and the other son follows that up with a murder. Scheming one, as a matter of fact, right? And so, what happens now? Well, we'll just walk through. You can't walk all the way through chapter 14. So, David still doesn't do anything. So Absalom's gone for 3 years. You pick up at the beginning of chapter 14. Joab is the one that's going to take action here. And so he sends this wise woman to David in the first 7 verses. And this wise woman confronts David with this story. So what does this remind you of? Nathan coming to David with a story. And so she tells him this story about sons. One son has killed the other. And so at the end, David is basically advocating for a fictional son who committed murder. But David the whole time is failing to do anything about his own son who has committed murder. He's not doing anything to protect him, anything to reconcile any of that. And so that exposes him. David recognizes that Joab's hand is behind it, but still. Absalom eventually returns to Jerusalem after some time. But if you look in verse 24 of chapter 14, so this is after this whole story and trying to get Absalom back. In verse 23, well, I'll just do 24. And the king said, so Absalom's back now in Jerusalem after going to Geshur. In verse 24, let him dwell apart in his own house. He is not to come into my presence. And so Absalom lived apart in his own house and did not come into the king's presence. Well, that's a heck of a reunion. Joab's like, okay, get Absalom back here. So Absalom comes back. David says, yeah, fine. Make sure he stays over there. And so in verse 28, Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem with this distance without coming into the king's presence. And so Absalom sends to Joab to send him to the king, but Joab doesn't come to him. Sends a second time. Joab doesn't come to him. So he thinks he's got Joab in his corner. He's like, I need to talk to Joab so he can figure something out here after 2 years. And Joab's just ignoring him. And so then he said to his servants, okay, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go set it on fire. So the servant does. Joab arose and went to Absalom at his house and said to him, what'd you set my field on fire for? Absalom said, well, I sent word to you, come here that I may send you the king to ask, why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to still be there. So let me go to the king. If there's guilt in me, let him put me to death. So in other words, it's like, why did you set my field on fire? That's the only way I could get your attention. I sent to you 2 other times. And so he does. Verse 33. Then Joab went to the king and told him, and he summoned Absalom. So he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. And so we think, okay, things are good, but there's still this kind of eerie silence about what's happened. Are things set right? Well, we don't have to wait too long because we go into the 4th part of the story, and that's the treacherous insurrection, starting in verse 1 of chapter 15. So let's read these verses. Does my alarm not go off? Okay, yeah, we're still in good time. Okay, let's read these verses and we'll have to stop. We'll get through the section and we'll stop. Verse 15. After this, okay, so he's been kissed by his father. After this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, what city are you from? And when he said, your servant is of such and such tribe in Israel, Absalom would say to him, so your claims are good and right. There's no man designated by the king to hear you. And then Absalom would say, well, oh, that I were judge in the land. And then every man with a dispute or a cause might come to me, and I would give him justice. Whenever a man came near to pay homage to him, he would put out his hand, take hold of him, and kiss him. And thus Absalom did to all Israel who came to the king for judgment. And so, unsurprisingly, Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. So, very briefly again, Absalom is standing at the gate and promises justice. So my question would be, why is he doing this? Why is he doing this? What is subtly suggested by Absalom's actions here?
That David's not doing a good job.
That's right.
It's not that subtle either.
Well, yeah, but maybe from a literary perspective, I meant like the subtle suggestion as you're reading it is, hey, you're not going to get justice from my dad. How does he know that?
Because
He doesn't. He doesn't think he got justice from his dad. Don't go to my dad for justice, but if you could come to me, I'd give you justice. And, he's shaking their hands, he's hugging them. And so, again, there's some commentary. This is Tim Chester. The genius of this tactic is that Absalom never actually has to make any hard decisions. He doesn't have to judge the cases. He just has to promise people that if he could, everything would be great. You'd get justice for me. He could just go around implying that he would decide in your favor. Sound familiar? Everyone thinks he's on their side. He portrays himself as a man of the people. It all has a very contemporary ring to it. Absalom is the consummate political operator. He's a spin doctor's dream. The predictable outcome is that Absalom stole the hearts of the people of Israel. Of course. He's going around, kissing babies. What's not to love in Absalom? Man, we should have this guy set up on the front. And so here it begins. And so that will take us to the first four. And so we pick up with the troublesome departure. And it's part 5. So let's go ahead and are there any questions first before we take a break? Is there anywhere where you feel like there's a gap where you're not following the story? Because again, we haven't read all the chapters, obviously, because again, it's a big chunk of narrative. Yeah, Jane.
Can we figure out whose mother, what? We don't know anything about their mothers.
Right.
Because we
Not
learned about David's
here.
first wife, and then all the other wives are.
Yeah, I'd have to investigate that a little bit more. But we don't learn of it here. Maybe if you went to 2 Chronicles or some other genealogy that I'm not thinking of now, maybe it would give us an indication of that. Yeah, Paul.
It does list the mothers in Kings.
In where at?
I don't remember.
Okay.
Or maybe it's in 1 Samuel.
Yeah. I still remember. Okay, so there is a way to find
But
it.
there's nothing particularly significant about whose son is who.
Yeah. In Samuel, in Kings that becomes significant at the outset because of Solomon's rise, right? The lineage of that. But I'll have to look that up. It's a good question. But I'm glad you brought that up because one thing I did want to say about that was just a reminder that although the Bible does record the occurrences of polygamy, having more than one wife, particularly among those who have some status, right? We don't necessarily see this with your average run-of-the-mill Israelite. That's the picture I think people get when they read the Bible, is that Israel was just filled with people who were marrying multiple wives. No, it isn't. I mean, you have Abraham, Jacob, who's tricked into it, but then also, has children with maidservants. And then, of course, you have royalty. David has multiple wives. Solomon has multiple wives. That's very common in ancient Near East for kings to have multiple wives and concubines. But it's not your average run-of-the-mill Israelite. It's not having multiple wives. And the point I want to make here is when the Bible depicts relationships where polygamy is part of it, it never turns out very well. Right? It always is complicated. Just think of Jacob. It's like, that doesn't go well. Think about Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael and all that's like that doesn't go well. So the Bible is recording the occurrences of polygamy at times, but we shouldn't, and although it doesn't explicitly in those contexts, in the narrative, deliver a judgment against it, it paints it in a negative light consistently. This never goes well because it's not God's pattern. If you want to know God's pattern, go back to Genesis chapter 1. And when Adam needed a partner, he gave him a wife. Right? Not multiple wives, not another man, but a wife to fulfill the cultural mandate at the end of Genesis 1. So, anyway, yeah, I'm glad you brought up that point. Any other questions before we break?
Just noting that all of the ramifications described from the original indiscretion are really within the family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But things like that have a way of getting out.
Yes.
And so you wonder what the ramifications might have been in the broader community and how they viewed the family.
Yeah, very true. They have a way of getting out, and I mean, we do see how this is eventually going to end up in maybe not a large-scale warfare, but it does end up in a significant loss of life because of the clashes between Absalom's people and David's people. Right? I mean, that's hardly just a private kind of matter. It's nobody else's business. That's not really such a thing. Really? I mean, that doesn't mean there's not such a thing as privacy. It just means that we shouldn't think that the way we conduct ourselves can remain isolated. I don't know what any of you think about COVID, but my background is in physiology and health science and communicable diseases. And one of the things that COVID reminded us of, if anything, is like we're kind of all connected. Like I can make you sick and you can make me sick, and it matters kind of what we're doing. And it's like that's always the case. Like that's the case whether there's a pandemic or not. It's like that there just isn't this kind of way to be like I can live however I want, and nobody should be concerned about that except me. It's like, well, where do you think you live? Like you are part of varying sizes of corporate entities, whether within a nuclear family or a larger extended family or a neighborhood or a community or a region or a state or a nation or a globe. It's like you're not isolated. You're never going to be isolated. And so the things that you think, the ways that you act, they impact people around you. It's inescapable. Not to the same degree, right? I mean, some acts are going to impact people more negatively than other acts, but to think that you just isolate these things, it doesn't really matter. I think Roger said it well. Stuff has a way of getting out. Both our vices and our virtue affects people. So we'll break there. Take 5. I think